First, I would like to start with a very joyful, catchy video.
Spokojnie.
Can we turn it on? This is episode from Soviet movie about Georgian, like ordinary, typical Georgian that Soviet propaganda describes us. And it was filmed in 1977. And now let's watch how Russian propaganda describes typical, ordinary Georgian.
Когда-то мы с тобой снялись на фоточку, потом разъехались всему свой срок.
So you can see the same aesthetic, the same guy on the same table with the same food, song, wine, and even the same lady, I suppose, next to him. So that's how propaganda defines the role model for the nation or even state communities that you represent, then create stereotypes, myths, and legends, and then make it common sense. And here the global strolling is starting. That's how Soviet and then Russian propaganda creates some understanding about ordinary, typical Georgians, like a country, Orthodox country, surrounded by Islamic empires, protected by Russia, and with a people with a great cultural heritage, winery tradition. But when the propaganda raised the question about, are you sure that this people has any ability to create its own state by their own? The propaganda's answer is definitely no. So how it works? They misinforms you, then plays with your emotions, and then they find your pressure points. And then Russian propaganda creates the failed nation idea. Why it's important? Because for Russian propaganda is an appropriate the success of the country that it considers as its own backyard. The same we have in 2003, after Rose Revolution in Georgia, when Georgia was a real superstar in the region with all those successful reforms. And Russian propaganda should have to admit it, but then they create very sophisticated narrative. They really admit that some of reforms were really great and nice and wrote about it articles, but then they promote another narrative. They started to compromising the independent country's leadership and Georgian establishment and create such a conspiracy theory that are you sure that these joyful people made it by their own selves or someone helped them? And that's how they work in Ukraine nowadays and even in Poland. In Russian media, we've seen a lot of articles about it during past few weeks about President Poroshenko and his addiction to alcohol. And what we see with Poland, that they're writing the articles and they always underline that every Polish leader are kind of afraid of Russia, despite of your country being the member of NATO. And it's interesting that this narrative toward leadership are in contrast with toward population. This is President Putin's quote about Georgian people and his warmest attitude to Georgian nation. And the same we have toward Ukrainian population. And let me tell you about another image of Georgians in Russian propaganda. This is new generation. People was burning after Soviet Union collapse and with a strong liberal values. And how Russia works with this part of generation in its own media. Maybe you all know this rally in Tbilisi city center when these young people, it's interesting that they're also dancing, they're raving. They were against brutal action of police in Tbilisi. And then Russia connects them to the discussion in Georgian society about legalization of marijuana and present them in this way. So in Russian media, you can see such articles with the headline, you can read, and see how they spin the understanding of this new generation, very liberal. And what we've seen next, we've seen far-right parties, and they promise us to defend Georgian society from Western influence. And they spread hate speech toward minorities, and the main target is an orthodoxy of Georgian and the same as Russia. And even the Tomos of Ukrainian church divide Georgian society on two parts. It's interesting that Georgian Orthodox Church haven't congratulated Kiev officially yet, because Russian, backed by Russia, political forces in Georgia spread fakes that if Georgian church do it, Russia recognizes the churches in occupied region, which is total fake, because we all know that this is a privilege of Constantinople. And we also have the tons of fakes about NATO and EU coming from these far-right parties. So after the Russian-Georgian war in 2008, Russia has reached the more people with its soft power than they managed it before. Why? They create really sophisticated propaganda ecosystem and switch from Georgian language, from Russian language to Georgian, and create satellites in media, NGOs, and political parties. But what we received as a result? We received the anti-propaganda immunity from this new generation. We have a lot of people, young people, raising awareness of society toward propaganda, toward anti-Western values, promoting parties, toward occupation problem. And they even trolled back Russia with their own trick, unique trick, and I will show you later the video, with this image of Tradition Georgia, when last summer in Tbilisi was held the organized by Putin Foundation conference. They make such really interesting rally and promote on this rally anti-occupation lozung. We can watch it now, shortly. So it is a rally. So, how it affects on you? I really want you to remember from my presentation, not the sketchy videos, but these 3 bullet points, and the quote and the prediction that President of Poland, Lech Kaczynski, was made during 2008 Russian-Georgian war in Tbilisi. Thank you.